Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Today we're going to take a look at what H.G. Wells has to say about early China. I already did the comparison section where he talks about how he thinks that Chinese civilization has certain edges over Rome. So now let's get into the earlier sections that he has on China and a little bit of what he has to say afterwards. I've drawn here from three distinct sections of the book since his coverage of China is divided. Overall, I think he did a really good job considering the time period in which he wrote, when Western knowledge of China was a little bit underdeveloped. If anything, I think that his coverage was rather prescient. One of the things that he did really well here is that he decided to accept Chinese claims to antiquity, something that most Westerners were skeptical of, if not downright scornful of, at the time. Most Western scholars assume that Chinese antiquity must not have dated back very far, and a lot of what drove them was effectively racism. However, in the years since, especially the last 30 to 40 years, archaeology has pretty much proven that the Chinese are right about their own history, and that in fact, the early days of Chinese civilization go back a very long way indeed, pretty comparable to other civilizations in the Old World. He also has an interesting idea about perhaps Chinese civilization actually starting in the south and spreading north rather than the other way around, as was tradition, but actually archaeology ended up proving the tradition in the event. The term Mandarins that he uses at one time is now outdated. Most of the time when people speak of Chinese civilization, they talk about bureaucrat scholars or bureaucrat scholars, something along those lines. So the term Mandarin is not something you'll probably hear outside of this video. The idea of great lords who don't have large estates that he tries to promote at one point was actually pretty wrong, however. He says that China never had a great landholding class. That's actually false. If you look at the Three Kingdoms period, you see that there were a number of people who owed their position to their wealth and their families' estates. So that is not quite accurate. He also does some interesting comparisons of education's power in China versus in Western civilization, and I think that's actually one of his stronger points of comparison. Also, the general idea of comparing China with the West is something that has become very popular among scholars in the years since, so he also was at the forefront of that in many ways. It's funny in retrospect to see someone discuss China as, quote, still traditional. Obviously, when he wrote in 1920, the Maoist revolution had not yet happened. There's a clear bias against the Brahmins of India, which comes up in one of these sections, and this is because the Brahmins are an aristocracy who don't earn their position, and as we know from what Wells has to say about Rome, he doesn't think very highly of them, and that's also part of his sort of Marxist analysis, is that he very much is a champion of the oppressed. At one point, he uses the spelling Asoka rather than Ashoka for the great conqueror of India, and here I followed his spellings as best I can and pronounced things as they're spelled as he wrote them. So don't be thinking that Anakin's Padawan learner was one of the great promoters of Buddhism outside of India. It was, in fact, Ashoka. There's also an interesting discussion of Confucius, and he has a great comparison with Plato that I found pretty instructive, and I think he does a good job of driving home the parallels in a way that I have never encountered before. However, one thing that he got a little bit off is that he seems to underestimate the speed of Buddhism's spread. Buddhism was actually already pretty well known by the late Han Dynasty. He seems to think that it really wasn't a big deal until perhaps the Tang period, so he's off by several centuries there. But again, not a huge mistake, and this is actually something I just learned very recently myself as I've been preparing for my Three Kingdoms tier list, so there you go. He also has an interesting and I think somewhat funny discussion of the problem of trying to translate the Confucian term aristocratic man. Today, texts call this person a gentleman, but apparently this was a huge debate among Chinese scholars at the time. How do you translate this into English in a way which is accurate and which conveys what Confucius is trying to say. And I guess gentleman was the best word they could come up with, but even that does seem a little vague and also a little stilted. But in his work, he uses the term aristocratic man and says that he's not into the idea of superior man, because a lot of times when people say stuff like that, they're mocking the person that they're describing. So I found that to be an interesting look into the state of trying to do popular translations for English-speaking audiences in the 1920s. So, without any further ado, let's get into what H.G. Wells has to say about China. And I think that for the most part, like me, you will be impressed. I think you'll like it. Chapter 13, The Early Empires, Section 5. Meanwhile, as this triple system of white man civilizations developed in India and in the lands about the meeting places of Asia, Africa, and Europe, another and quite distinctive civilization was developing and spreading out from the then fertile but now dry and desolate valley of the Tarim, and from the slopes of the Kuen-Lun Mountains in two directions down the course of the Huanghe, and later into the valley of the Yangtze-Kiang. We know little as yet of the archaeology of China. Stone implements have been found in various parts of the country, and we know something of the culture of the Stone Age in this part of the world from excavations in Honan and Manchuria. The people appear to have been not unlike the present inhabitants of northern China. They lived in villages and had domesticated the pig. They used axes and rectangular knives of stone, and arrowheads of slate, bone, and mussel shell. They were acquainted with spinning and made pottery, some of it of much the same type as is made today. Apart from this scanty evidence, our ideas at present of this early civilization are derived from the still very imperfectly explored Chinese literature. It has evidently been from the first and throughout a Mongolian civilization. Until after the time of Alexander the Great, there are few traces of any Aryan or Semitic, much less of Hamitic influence. All such influences were still in another world, separated by mountains, deserts, and wild nomadic tribes until that time. The Chinese seem to have made their civilization spontaneously and unassisted. Some recent writers suppose, indeed, a connection with ancient Sumer, and the occurrence of a peculiar type of painted pottery in the excavations in Honan, similar to pottery found on a few early sites in Central and Western Asia and in Eastern Europe, suggests the possibility of a remote cultural contact. Of course, both China and Sumer arose on the basis of the almost worldwide early Neolithic culture, but the Tarim Valley and the lower Euphrates are separated by such vast obstacles of mountain and desert as to forbid the idea of any immigration or interchange of peoples who had once settled down. Perhaps the movement from the north met another movement of culture coming from the south. Though the civilization of China is wholly Mongolian, it does not follow that its northern roots are its only ones. If it grew first in the Tarim Valley, then, unlike all other civilizations, including the Mexican and Peruvian, it did not grow out of the Heliolithic culture. We Europeans know very little as yet of the ethnology and prehistory of southern China. There, the Chinese mingle with such kindred peoples as the Siamese and Burmese, and seem to bridge over towards the darker Dravidian peoples and towards the Malays. It is quite clear from the Chinese records that there were southern as well as northern beginnings of a civilization, and that the Chinese civilization that comes into history 2,000 years BC is the result of a long process of conflicts, minglings, and interchanges between a southern and northern culture, of which the southern may have been the earlier and more highly developed. The southern Chinese perhaps played the same role towards the northern Chinese that the Hamites or Sumerians played to the Aryan and Semitic peoples in the west, or that the settled Dravidians played towards the Aryans in India. They may have been the first agriculturalists and the first temple builders, but so little is known as yet of this attractive chapter in prehistory that we cannot dwell further upon it here. The chief foreigners mentioned in the early annals of China were a Ural-Altaic people on the northeast frontier, the Huns, against whom certain of the earlier emperors made war. Chinese history is still very little known to European students, and our accounts of the early records are particularly unsatisfactory. About 2700 to 2400 BC reigned 5 emperors, who seem to have been almost incredibly exemplary beings. There followed upon these first 5 emperors a series of dynasties, of which the accounts become more and more exact and convincing as they become more recent. China has to tell a long history of border warfare and of graver struggles between the settled and nomad peoples. To begin with, China, like Sumer and like Egypt, was a land of city-states. The government was at first a government of numerous kings. They became loosely feudal under an emperor, as the Egyptians did. And then later, as with the Egyptians, came a centralizing empire. Shang, 1750 to 1125 BC, and Chao, 1125 to 250 BC, are named as being the 2 great dynasties of the feudal period. Bronze vessels of these earlier dynasties, beautiful, splendid, and with a distinctive style of their own, still exist, and there can be no doubt of the existence of a high state of culture even before the days of Shang. It is perhaps a sense of symmetry that made the later historians of Egypt and China talk of the earlier phases of their national history as being under the dynasties comparable to the dynasties of the later empires, and of such early emperors as Menes in Egypt, or the first 5 emperors in China. The early dynasties exercised far less centralized powers than the later ones. Such unity as China possessed under the Shang dynasty was a religious rather than an effective political union. The Son of Heaven offered sacrifices for all the Chinese. There was a common script, a common civilization, and a common enemy in the Huns of the northwestern borders. The last of the Shang dynasty was a cruel and foolish monarch who burnt himself alive, 1125 BC, in his palace after a decisive defeat by Wu Wang, the founder of the Chao dynasty. Wu Wang seems to have been helped by the southwestern tribes as well as by a popular revolt. For a time, China remained loosely united under the Chao emperors, as loosely united as was Christendom under the popes in the Middle Ages. The Chao emperors had become the traditional high priest of the land in the place of the Shang dynasty, and claimed a sort of overlordship in Chinese affairs, but gradually the loose ties of usage and sentiment that held the empire together lost their hold upon men's minds. Hunnish peoples to the north and west took on the Chinese civilization without acquiring a sense of its unity. Feudal princes began to regard themselves as independent. In China and the League of Nations, Mr. Liang Qichao, one of the Chinese representatives at the Paris Conference of 1919, states that between the 8th and 4th centuries BC, there were in the Huanghe and Yangtze valleys no less than 5,000 or 6,000 small states with about a dozen states dominating over them. The land was subjected to perpetual warfare, age and confusion. In the 6th century BC, the great powers in conflict were Tsi and Tsin, which were northern Huanghe states, and Chu, which was a vigorous power in the Yangtze Valley. A confederation against Chu laid the foundation for a league that kept the peace for 100 years. The league subdued and incorporated Chu and made a general treaty of disarmament. It became the foundation of a new Pacific empire. The knowledge of iron entered China at some unknown date, but iron weapons began to be commonly used only about 500 BC, that is to say, 200 or 300 years or more after their use had become customary in Assyria, Egypt, and Europe. Iron was probably introduced from the north into China by the Huns. The last rulers of the Chao dynasty were ousted by the kings of Tsin. The latter seized upon the sacred sacrificial bronze tripods, and so were able to take over the imperial duty of offering sacrifices to heaven. In this manner was the Tsin dynasty established. It ruled with far more vigor and effect than any previous family. The reign of Shi Huangti, meaning first universal emperor, of this dynasty is usually taken to mark the end of the feudal and divided China. He seems to have played the unifying role in the East that Alexander the Great might have played in the West had he lived longer, and the unity he made or restored was comparatively permanent, while the empire of Alexander the Great fell to pieces, as we shall tell, at his death. Shi Huangti, among other feats in the direction of common effort, organized the building of the Great Wall of China against the Huns. A civil war followed close upon his reign and ended in the establishment of the Han Dynasty. Under this Han Dynasty, the empire grew greatly beyond its original two river valleys, the Huns were effectively restrained, and the Chinese penetrated westward until they began to learn at last of civilized races and civilizations other than their own. By 100 BC, the Chinese power had spread across Tibet and into western Turkestan, and the Chinese were trading by camel caravans with Persia and the Western world. So much for the present must suffice for our account of China. We shall return to the distinctive characters of its civilization later. Chapter 16, Gods and Stars, Priests and Kings. Section 7. In China, we find a social system traveling along yet another, and only a very roughly parallel line to that followed by the Indian and Western civilizations. The Chinese civilization, even more than the Hindu, is organized for peace, and the warrior plays but a small part in its social scheme. As in the Indian civilization, the leading class is an intellectual one, less priestly than the Brahmin and more official. But unlike the Brahmins, the Mandarins, who are the literate men of China, are not a caste. One is not a Mandarin by birth, but by education. Mandarins are drawn by education and examination from all classes of the community, and the son of a Mandarin has no prescriptive right to succeed his father. As a consequence of these differences, while the Brahmins of India are, as a class, ignorant even of their own sacred books, mentally slack, and full of a pretentious assurance, the Chinese Mandarin has the energy that comes from hard mental work. But since his education so far has been almost entirely a scholarly study of the classical Chinese literature, his influence has been entirely conservative. Before the days of Alexander the Great, China had already formed itself and set its feet in the way in which it was still walking in the year AD 1900. Invaders and dynasties have come and gone, but the routine of life of the Yellow civilization has remained unchanged. The traditional Chinese social system recognized four main classes below the priest-emperor. A, the literary class, which was equivalent partly to the officials of the Western world and partly to its teachers and clerics. In the time of Confucius, its education included archery and horsemanship. Rites and music, history and mathematics completed the, quote, 6 accomplishments. B, the cultivators of the land. C, the artisans. D, the mercantile class. But since from the earliest times it has been the Chinese way to divide the landed possessions of a man among his sons, there has never been in Chinese history any class of great landowners renting their land to tenants, such as most other countries have displayed. The Chinese land has always been cut up into small holdings, which are chiefly freeholds and cultivated intensively. There are landlords in China who own one or a few farms and rent them to tenants, but there are no great permanent estates. When a patch of land, by repeated division, is too small to sustain a man, it is sold to some prospering neighbor, and the former owner drifts to one of the great towns of China to join the mass of wage-earning workers there. In China, for many centuries, there have been these masses of town population with scarcely any property at all. Men neither serfs nor slaves, but held to their daily work by their utter impecuniousness. From such masses it is that the soldiers needed by the Chinese government are recruited, and also such gang labor as has been needed for the making of canals, the building of walls, and the like has been drawn. The war captive and the slave class play a smaller part in Chinese history than in any more westerly record of these ages before the Christian era. One fact, we may note, is common to all these three stories of developing social structure, and that is the immense power exercised by the educated class in the early stages before the crown or commonality began to read and consequently to think for itself. In India, by reason of their exclusiveness, the Brahmins, the educated class, retain their influence to this day. Over the masses of China, along entirely different lines, and because of the complexities of the written language, the Mandarinate has prevailed. The diversity of race and tradition in the more various and eventful world of the West has delayed, and perhaps arrested forever, any parallel organization of the specially intellectual elements of society into a class ascendancy. In the Western world, as we have already noted, education early slopped over and soaked away out of the control of any special class. It escaped from the limitations of caste and priesthoods and traditions into the general life of the community. Writing and reading had been simplified down to a point when it was no longer possible to make a cult and mystery of them. It may be due to the peculiar elaboration and difficulty of the Chinese characters rather than to any racial difference that the same thing did not happen to a like extent in China. Chapter 24, The Rise and Spread of Buddhism, Section 5. It is thought that the vast benefactions of Asoka finally corrupted Buddhism by attracting to its order great numbers of mercenary and insincere adherents, but there can be no doubt that its extension throughout Asia was very largely due to his stimulus. It made its way into Central Asia through Afghanistan and Turkestan, and so reached China. Buddhist teaching reached China, says Professor Pramatha Nath Bose, about AD 64 in the reign of the Emperor Ming Ti of the Han Dynasty. The Pandit Kajapa was the apostle of China, and he was followed by a series of other great teachers. The great days of the Buddhist propaganda in China were the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. It then underwent grievous persecutions and re-emerged to prominence and the coming of the Tang Dynasty. Buddhism found in China a popular and prevalent religion already established, Taoism, a development of very ancient and primitive magic and occult practices. It was reorganized as a distinctive cult by Chang Taoling in the days of the Han Dynasty. Tao means the way, which corresponds closely with the idea of the Aryan path. The two religions, after an opening struggle, spread side by side and underwent similar changes, so that nowadays their outward practice is very similar. Buddhism also encountered Confucianism, which was even less theological and even more a code of personal conduct. And finally it encountered the teachings of Lao Tzu, anarchist, evolutionist, pacifist, and moral philosopher, which were not so much a religion as a philosophical rule of life. The teachings of this Lao Tzu were later to become incorporated with the Taoist religion by Chen Tuan, the founder of modern Taoism. Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, like the great southern teacher Lao Tzu and Gautama, lived also in the 6th century BC. His life has some interesting parallelisms with that of some of the more political of the Greek philosophers of the 5th and 4th centuries. The 6th century BC falls into the period assigned by Chinese historians to the Zhou dynasty, but in those days the rule of that dynasty had become little more than nominal. The emperor conducted the traditional sacrifices of the Son of Heaven and received a certain formal respect. Even his nominal empire was not a sixth part of the China of today. We have already glanced at the state of affairs in China at this period. Practically, China was a multitude of warring states open to the northern barbarians. Confucius was a subject in one of those states, Lu. He was of aristocratic birth, but poor, and, after occupying various official positions, he set up a sort of academy in Lu for the discovery and imparting of wisdom. And we also find Confucius traveling from state to state in China, seeking a prince who would make him his counselor and become the center of a reformed world. Plato, 2 centuries later, in exactly the same spirit, went as advisor to the tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse, and we have already noted the attitudes of Aristotle and Isocrates toward Philip of Macedon. The teaching of Confucius centered upon the idea of a noble life which he embodied in a standard or ideal, the aristocratic man. This phrase is often translated into English as the superior person, but as superior and person, like respectable and genteel, have long become semi-humorous terms of abuse. This rendering is not fair to Confucianism. He did present to his time the ideal of a devoted public man. The public side was very important to him. He was far more of a constructive political thinker than Gautama or Laozi. His mind was full of the condition of China, and he sought to call the aristocratic man into existence very largely in order to produce the noble state. One of his sayings may be quoted here. It is impossible to withdraw from the world and associate with the birds and beasts that have no affinity with us. With whom should I associate but with suffering men? The disorder that prevails is what requires my efforts. If right principles ruled through the kingdom, there would be no necessity for men to change its state. The political basis of his teachings seems to be characteristic of Chinese moral ideas. There is a much directer reference to the state than is the case with most Indian and European moral and religious doctrine. For a time he was appointed magistrate in Chengtu, a city of the dukedom of Lu, and here he sought to regulate life to an extraordinary extent, to subdue every relationship and action, indeed, to the rule of an elaborate etiquette. Ceremonial in every detail, such as we are wont to see only in the courts of rulers and the households of high dignitaries, became obligatory on the people at large, and all matters of daily life were subject to rigid rule. Even the food which the different classes of people might eat was regulated. Males and females were kept apart in the streets. Even the thickness of coffins and the shape and situation of graves were made the subject of regulations. That is all, as people say, very Chinese. No other people have ever approached moral order and social stability through the channel of manners. Yet in China, at any rate, the methods of Confucius have had an enormous effect, and no nation in the world today has such a universal tradition of decorum and self-restraint. Later on, the influence of Confucius over his duke was undermined, and he withdrew again into private life. His last days were saddened by the deaths of some of his most promising disciples. No intelligent ruler, he said, arises to take me as his master, and my time has come to die. But he died to live. Says Hirth, quote, "There can be no doubt that Confucius has had a greater influence on the development of the Chinese national character than many emperors taken together. He is, therefore, one of the essential figures to be considered in connection with any history of China. That he could influence his nation to such a degree was, it appears to me, due more to the peculiarity of the nation than that of his own personality. Had he lived in any other part of the world, his name would perhaps be forgotten. As we have seen, he had formed his character and personal views on man's life from a careful study of documents closely connected with moral philosophy cultivated by former generations. What he preached to his contemporaries was, therefore, not all new to them, but having himself, in the study of old records, heard the dim voice of the sages of the past, he became, as it were, the megaphone phonograph through which were expressed to the nation those views which he had derived from the early development of the nation itself. The great influence of Confucius's personality on national life in China was due not only to his writings and his teachings as recorded by others, but also to his doings. His personal character, as described by his disciples and in the accounts of later writers, some of which may be entirely legendary, has become the pattern for millions of those who are bent on imitating the outward manners of a great man. Whatever he did in public was regulated to the minutest detail by ceremony. This was no invention of his own, since ceremonial life had been cultivated many centuries before Confucius, but his authority and example did much to perpetuate what he considered desirable social practices." End quote. The teaching of Laozi, who was for a long time in charge of the imperial library of the Zhou dynasty, was much more mystical and vague and elusive than that of Confucius. He seems to have preached a stoical indifference to the pleasures and powers of the world and a return to an imaginary simple life of the past. He left writings very contracted in style and very obscure. He wrote in riddles. After his death, Lao Tzu's teachings, like the teachings of Gautama Buddha, were corrupted and overlaid by legends, and had the most complex and extraordinary observances and superstitious ideas grafted upon them. But the teaching of Confucius was not so overlaid, because it was limited and plain and straightforward and lent itself to no such distortions. The Chinese speak of Buddhism and the doctrines of Lao Tzu and Confucius as the three teachings. Together they constitute the basis and point of departure of all later Chinese thought. Their thorough study is a necessary preliminary to the establishment of any real intellectual and moral community between the great people of Europe, or in the East, and the Western world. There are certain things to be remarked in common of all these three teachers, of whom Gautama was indisputably the greatest and profoundest, whose doctrines to this day dominate the thought of the great majority of human beings. There are certain features in which their teaching contrasts with the thoughts and feelings that were soon to take possession of the Western world. Primarily, they are personal and tolerant doctrines. They are doctrines of a way, of a path, of a nobility, and not doctrines of a church or a general rule. And they offer nothing either for or against the existence and worship of the current gods. The Athenian philosophers, page got stuck, sorry, it is also to be noted, had just the same theological detachment. Socrates was quite willing to bow politely or sacrifice formally to almost any divinity, reserving his private thoughts. This attitude is flatly antagonistic to the state of mind that was growing up in the Jewish communities of Judea, Egypt, and Babylonia, in which the thought of the one God was first and foremost. Neither Gautama, nor Lao Tzu, nor Confucius had any inkling of this idea of a jealous God, a God who would have none other gods, a God of terrible truth, who would not tolerate any lurking belief in magic, witchcraft, or old customs, or any sacrificing to the God King, or any trifling with the stern unity of things.